the upcoming TPRC as we get people that are going to join us. That currently the program committee is reviewing abstracts, and we have just about finished doing all of the reviewing. And David and I spent a good amount of time yesterday arguing about tenth of points and who gets what, and the Tiger team looks at it next. And so we'll start to let people know. Our student paper contest is still open and active. And so anyone who has a student that might want to turn something in for the student paper would be great. And then the Charles Benton Early Scholar Award competition is still active as well. And of course, all of that information is on our website, www.tprcweb.com.
Keep going, Laura.
Okay. So yeah, I have another minute and a half that I can touch you. Let's see. We're really excited as this is going to be the 50th TPRC, and we're planning on some interesting and different things to look back as well as forward. That 50 years is a long time, and this industry has changed significantly in those 50 years. And so we hope that everybody will be joining us to celebrate and to look at ways that we need to be moving forward, because I think that that's a really important part of what we do. So David, we are 1 o'clock straight up. We do have a good number of people that are joining us, though you might want to give them a few more minutes before you begin.
Why don't we give them at least one more minute?
Give everybody another minute.
Yeah.
So we were talking about registration for this fall's TPRC, which will be in September. Will be available probably beginning in June. That the program committee is currently finishing their reviews of abstracts, and that we hope to have the accepted papers announced by certainly by the first week in June. You will see all of the accepted papers and the panels that we will be having at the September conference, and we look forward to everybody joining us at that time. Petros has actually put information in the chat with the website. Thank you, Petros. We will be having a virtual component to the conference. So if you are unable to travel to Washington this year, we certainly do want you to join us anyway. And so we were actually talking about the excitement of trying to coordinate both a live as well as a virtual conference, chewing gum and walking at the same time. And it should be very exciting for all of us to try and figure out. This will be the first time that we do that. We've been virtual for the last 2 conferences. And so we look forward to being together.
All right. Thank you, Laura.
You're welcome, David.
Why don't we go ahead and get it started? My name is David Reed. I am Laura was just talking about the TPRC, and I'm the chair this year of the programming committee. So we are very much looking forward to the 50th that's coming up here in September. And so if you haven't, you should go to the website that is on the chat and check out the conference if you're not familiar with it. And for those who are, we look forward to seeing you. Most of the folks at this point in time are planning to be there in person. So looking forward to seeing old friends and colleagues when we have it upcoming in September. So today's webinar is about a really timely topic. It's about the future really of the Universal Service Fund. And, you know, I teach a telecom policy class, and I always try to stress to the students that they are in the midst of a very historic period where universal service has changed, is turning over from telephony and telephone service to broadband. And so this is a significant point in time for society. And the FCC has actually initiated a proceeding in December of 2021 that is trying to look at the future of universal service. And in that proceeding and discussion, there have been different proposals associated with how do we fund universal service as it becomes focused on broadband. And today we have three different distinguished speakers who have different points of view on this, and they have some areas of common agreement. But I think in the sense of being able to understand and lay out and comprehend the impact and the issues that are and the complex trade-offs associated with how we fund the universal service going forward. Again, it's a very historic moment as the internet has become mature, right? And it becomes part of what everybody agrees is an essential part for individuals to be able to participate in society. So the three speakers we have, the first is, and I'll introduce you in the order that you'll be presenting, and then we will, the structure for the webinar is each one of our participants will basically talk for 5 to 10 minutes about their point of view on this topic. And then we'll open up for Q&A, and that Q&A can come through chat. And please, do not be bashful on providing questions or comments through chat. We'll try to raise them as much as we can. Petrus Potgeider, who I'm not introducing, he's not on the panel, but he proposed this webinar for TPRC, and he is going to be assisting as well in terms of maybe helping to identify some key questions and discussions that will come up. So please plan on participating as much as you can. All right, so we'll start with Carol. Carol runs Maddie Consulting, which is an LLC, and is a former deputy chief at the FCC's Wireline Competition Bureau. I see in your bio, you've left out your participation in the National Broadband Plan. She helped to contribute as an author there. And as she knows, I'm a fan of that. It seems to have fallen out of favor a little bit in terms of folks recognizing it, but that is a great contribution for us. She has a doctorate in law from the University of Pennsylvania, and she's blogged at the Benton Foundation, Brookings Institute, and Medium, and has testified before Congress on broadband investments in rural America. Our second participant is Hal Singer. He's the managing director at Econ One Research in Washington, D.C., and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business. He has a PhD in economics from Johns Hopkins University, and he has had essays that have appeared in the Harvard Business Review, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. And he has testified before Congress on the interplay between antitrust and sector-specific regulations. And we also have Rosalind Layton. She is a senior vice president at Strand Consult and a visiting researcher at Aalborg University in Denmark. She had a PhD in business economics from Aalborg University and is also a senior contributor at Forbes. And she has testified before the Congress as well. And she is my predecessor as the program committee chair at TPRC. And so am I pronouncing Aalborg right? Is that right? Okay. Yeah. Okay, good. So with that, Carol, I'll turn it over to you for some opening comments. Each one of our presenter has some slides, so you can share your slides and we will get started.
First of all, thank you. And I want to warn everybody, I unfortunately have a bad head cold. And so if I have to pause and cough, I will try to do it as discreetly as possible. And I'm hoping to get through my presentation as quickly as possible. Looking forward to the Q&A. But thank you for that introduction. I'm going to talk about the US Ford report that I published. Did I successfully share that?
We can see it.
You can see it. Okay, you all got small, but I'm not going to worry about it. Anyway, I was asked by 3 trade associations.
So Carol, if you can go into presentation mode, that will help with the slide.
Where am I?
That's the down below the little.
I'm having difficulty.
Then go ahead. We can see it. Okay. I was just.
You can see it. Well, I'm just.
We can see it. There's just it's the little screen icon at the bottom on the bottom right that if you press it, then the whole screen becomes the slide, but
I'm not seeing that, and my apologies.
okay, we'll go forward. We can see the slide.
Huh. Weird. Anyway, I should have said at the outset, I was the Deputy Bureau Chief at the FCC, and for over 15 years, I oversaw the Universal Service Fund, including the contributions methodology. So this is a topic that I have worked on literally for 2 decades now, both in government and also while outside of government. But in any event, as I was saying, I was asked by 3 trade associations to look at the historical trends for contributions and to examine the options for reform to the contribution methodology that the FCC could take within its existing statutory authority. And that is the focus of what my report focused on, is options that are within the FCC's existing authority. Before I get into the specifics of my recommendation, I thought it'd be useful just to spend a minute talking about how contributions works for those that may not be fully familiar with it. Every quarter, the FCC sets what is known as the contribution factor, which is the assessment rate. And it sets the rate at whatever level is necessary to generate sufficient funding to pay out or make disbursements for the coming quarter, depending on the anticipated level of funding and the expected revenues that will be reported. The basic system has been in place since the 1990s, where assessments are based on the international and interstate and international telecommunications service revenues and other telecommunications revenues that the FCC has exercised what is known as discretionary authority to pull into the contribution base. Notably, the FCC does not.
Sorry, Carol, if you're talking to your second slide, we're still all seeing the first slide.
Well, that is unfortunate. I'm on the second slide.
There you go. We got it now.
Sorry. Attribute it to foggy brain. In any event, when I was trying, I apologize. The point I was about to make is the FCC a number of years ago exercised its discretionary authority to assess voice over IP. It has sought comment multiple times on assessing broadband, but today it does not assess broadband revenues either from fixed or mobile providers. About 10 service providers collectively contribute 80% of the fund today. That's not surprising. It's the largest service providers, both telcos and cable operators in the country, that obviously have the greatest amount of revenues, both from voice services as well as business services. Now, what we've seen over time is a dramatic decline in the assessable revenues. This chart starts off on the far left in 2001, which is when the FCC, while I was working on this, initiated the original contributions methodology reform docket. And certain changes were made in 2002. The FCC sought comment again in 2008. It sought comment again in 2012. It referred the question to what is known as the Universal Service Joint Board in 2014. The state members of the Universal Service Joint Board provided their thoughts to the FCC in 2019. And meanwhile, the overall assessable revenues have basically plummeted by 63% in that time frame. Now, the reason for that is not what we all assume to be the case. Often people assume that the reason that the revenues are declining is due to the decline in long distance revenues. But when, as shown in the report, the more dramatic decline in accessible revenues has actually been on the mobile side. Over the course of the last decade, the mobile revenues have significantly decreased. They've decreased like about 63%, whereas local has decreased like 30-some%, and toll revenues have decreased 40%. So as I mentioned, the FCC has sought comment multiple times on 3 options: assessing broadband revenues, assessing connections, or assessing working telephone numbers. I analyzed all 3 options in my report and came to the conclusion and recommended that the best course of those 3 options would be to assess broadband internet access revenues. According to my analysis, if the FCC were to expand the contribution base to include broadband internet access service revenues, the contribution factor would drop to less than 4%. The analysis that I did was based on estimates of broadband internet access revenues that I obtained from Wall Street analysts, and I used for program demand the FCC's own estimates of the USF disbursements or outlays that it presents on an annual basis in their budget, which becomes submitted to the Office of Management and Budget, and they do a 10-year forecast of program outlays, which is part of the president's budget. The reasons why I came to the conclusion that assessing broadband internet access revenues was the preferred approach was, first of all, as David mentioned in the introduction, the programs have all been reformed and modernized to support broadband services. And from a common sense public policy standpoint, it makes sense to actually assess broadband revenues to promote the purposes that the programs now are supporting. I think that one of the things that it's important to keep in mind is that the system in place has changed dramatically, and it's time for the FCC to move forward quickly. A second reason is that broadband revenues are expected to be stable. A third reason why I thought that this reform made sense is it is something that the FCC could easily do within its existing statutory authority, unlike the alternatives that my fellow panelists will talk about, which obviously would need to go before Congress, and that can take time. A fourth reason why I felt that assessing broadband revenues was the preferred approach compared to the alternatives of connections versus or numbers is that revenues are obviously available for publicly traded companies, which provides an additional mechanism to check to make sure that they're accurately reported. There's greater transparency into revenues. It would be building on an existing system and an existing data collection that the FCC has administered for many years. It wouldn't cause many changes to the existing system. Anytime you switch to a new system, there always inevitably are kinks and bugs to work out. And there's greater transparency into what revenues are, as I said, because most of the contributors today are publicly traded. And last but not least, I concluded that moving to broadband revenues would be more equitable. The impact of today's assessments, unfortunately, are falling disproportionately on those Americans that have not yet necessarily embraced broadband, often older Americans that still have a landline telephone. If we believe as a society that all of these programs are something that benefit all people, then all people should contribute to that societal good. And the last thing I'll mention is I know one of the common, criticisms of this proposal is that it would be regressive and it would impact low-income Americans. And there, I think it's really important to recognize that the FCC has always prohibited carriers from assessing a USF line item on customers that are in the Lifeline program, and it could easily do the same thing for customers that are receiving Lifeline or funding from the Affordable Connectivity Program. That's the way. That's a very pragmatic way to protect low-income households from any potential pass-through of the amount. And with that, I'll stop and turn it over to the next panelist.
Okay, thank you, Carol. And Hal, you're up next. If you want to share the screen. We have a question as you're bringing up if you'll be able to make slides available for all the panelists. So
can you see this okay, David? I was on mute. I'm sorry.
sorry, no. Yes, I can see it fine. Again, if you can go into display mode, that works. But
Let me see. I can go into slideshow play from the start. How's this? Better?
yeah.
Okay, good. All right, well, I'm going to talk a bit about this paper that I wrote with Ted Tados called Subsidizing Universal Broadband Through a Digital Advertising Services Fee. And I'll just kind of jump right in with the elevator pitch. You know, if I had 30 seconds to sell this idea, I think the most important thing is that the advertising base of revenues that against which this fee would be applied is big. It's at the same size right now as broadband, but it's growing at a much faster rate. And so by the year, say 2029, we estimate that the contribution factor on this bigger base of revenues would be much more manageable, it would be around 7%, whereas the contribution factor on the base of broadband revenues as of 2029 would be much larger, in fact, double, 14.7. Of course, Carol and I have different numbers there. She thinks it's below 4, but I'll try to convince you why I think I'm right. The second thing is we think that the likelihood that a fee on digital advertising platforms being passed through to consumers via advertisers is very, very small. And this is what's important. So the prices for digital advertisement, as everyone knows, are set by auction, and that makes it harder for the platform operator to necessarily figure out a way to pass those through onto advertisers. But even if it did pass it through to advertisers, if advertisers perceive those costs as a fixed cost, right? As a Pepsi's, cost of advertising digitally goes up by a couple million. The question is whether or not Pepsi is going to turn around and raise the price of its soft drink. And the answer is probably no, not unless it perceives those costs to be an incremental cost. And so we think that for those reasons, pass through of the tax when applied on digital advertisers would be very, very low. And in contrast, we think you're going to get 100% pass through if you try to impose it on ISPs. If you look at how ISPs or other cable operators have responded to similar taxes in the past, they show up almost dollar for dollar right on the bill. So that to us is the problem of putting it on ISPs. Some other benefits that I just want to mention. One is we think it aligns the interests of the payer and the beneficiary. So it enlarges the user base for publisher content that draws ad revenues for the leading digital ad networks. Of course, the ad networks is a highly concentrated industry. It's comprised primarily of two providers, Facebook and Google. The second thing is it levies the fee on contributors to the internet traffic load. So according to Sandvine research, just these two websites alone, Google and Facebook, account for 20% of all internet traffic, okay? Now, as I alluded to earlier, we think that taxing broadband is bad policy. It's bad policy to surcharge the very service you wish to promote. Imagine, we were having a conversation among economists, and we said, general R&D is underfunded. There's a spillover problem, and people are afraid to invest because their ideas are going to be appropriated or used in other specific applications. We need to subsidize general R&D. No economist in the room would say, let's fund general R&D by imposing a tax on general R&D and then using the proceeds from that tax to subsidize it, right? No one would do that. We'd go through the treasury or find some alternative means of raising the money, right? The other problem it's the second bullet, the other problem I mentioned, of course, is that broadband internet access bias has a non-zero price elasticity demand. And so surcharges will repress the demand. Carol suggested that maybe we could avoid this effect if we don't apply the tax on those who are receiving the subsidy. That doesn't get at the problem. The problem is those price sensitive types who don't qualify for the subsidy, and they're right on the margin. We call them marginal subscribers. It's those guys that we're worried about peeling off in response to an increase in the price of broadband. And then I guess that's the last point that I just made. So This gets to the thing about why is the revenue, the size of the plan bigger than we might think, or bigger than the current plan today, right? The current subsidies are around $9.25 a month. And with that small subsidy, we get very low adoption rates. If you look at this chart, we see that the average adoption rate for all those eligible for lifetime is a measly 18%. Right. And we see some exceptions in these states that are on the left. And the reason why we get these exceptions is because the states in those instances are supplementing the 925. In other words, when you make a real dent on the size of the bill, you actually get people to move and take the subsidy. Right. When the subsidy is too small relative to the bill, people aren't going to go through the effort to take advantage or avail themselves of the subsidy. So the bottom line is we think adoption depends on the size of the subsidy. And if you go with something in the $30, $50 range, which is what was in those bills that came during the pandemic relief, then the adoption rate is going to be much, much higher than the traditional 18%, right? And so we model a few different scenarios, one where adoption rate is 75%, which we acknowledge is pretty aggressive, but it could happen with such a subsidy. And then we also look at one, just an extreme case where we get to 95% adoption. And one of the key things that we want to focus on is what would happen if you were to impose this tax instead on broadband. And this comes right from our paper. It's a table 17. We got a lot of tables in this paper, but our best estimate, I won't take you through the entire math, but about 10 million, see this number, 9.73 million. That's our best estimate of the number of broadband subscribers who will no longer subscribe to broadband if this tax gets put onto the broadband bill, right? And you can work through the math, but we're using our best estimates of the price elasticity of demand that we can find in the economic literature. You can see is 0.62. Work through the math. I'm not going to kill you on this conference call here, but this is our best estimate, and that's a pretty big number, and it's something that we should try to avoid if possible. Now, when you do a comparison of what the contribution factor is going to look like, remember I highlighted the 7.3 on the first slide. You can see the comparable number if you were to apply it on digital advertising revenue. Sorry, here down at the bottom is the ISP number. That's the 14.6%, and you can see the comparable number up here, 7.3, if you apply it to digital advertising revenues instead. And this isn't really complicated math, guys. The reason, quite simply, is that the growth rate in digital advertising is very, very high right now. And so it's projected to be by the year 2029 to be almost double that of broadband revenue. So we have one of two choices. We can apply this fee on a stagnant set of revenues, right, and resulting high contribution factor, or we can apply it to a very fast growing revenue base and get a more manageable low contribution factor that likely won't be passed on to end users. Now, there is an objection, and we heard Carol make it today, and I just want to kind of take it head on. I think this is the best objection that she makes, is that whether or not she's doubtful, and I'm not going to disagree, that the FCC has authority to impose the fee in this area. And I want to just say that if even assuming that they don't, right, the question as a policymaker is, what is the best policy that should be done here? And if the best policy is to apply this to digital services, digital ad services, right, then we should go ask Congress for the authority to do so. Right. And sometimes good governance requires congressional intervention. I'm thinking about, should we just accept that Title II is the only source of authority to impose net neutrality? No. If we want to do something right in that space, we might have to go to Congress as well. I'm going to Congress and asking for all sorts of things, the self-preferencing ban on the platforms, right? Sometimes we have to go through Congress to get to the best policy. And if that's what's needed to be done here, then so be it. I want to just do two quick other. Do I have time, David? I didn't time myself. Do I have another minute to just hit these two other last issues?
You have 2 minutes.
Okay, fine. The first one is this question about how is Carol getting to the sub 4%? And I think that what she's doing is she's just holding the size of the contribution, the size of the funding constant over time. And I think that's not what this would look like, and it certainly is not what would be needed to move the needle and make a dent on low-income households and get them to subscribe to wireline broadband, right? And so if you do that and you're up in the $30s and $50 range per month, you're going to have a much higher adoption rate. That's going to result in the program being much higher than the current revenues. That's what this slide is about. And then finally, I think that there's an assumed growth rate in the stock of broadband revenues, and I would push back on that. When I look at like what's happening to the prices and to the revenues separately of broadband, we're at a fairly saturated point at around 80% of broadband adoption, and I'm not as optimistic about the growth of that revenue over time. In fact, my best projection is that it's going to be fairly stagnant. And so I think that's another assumption that Carol is making to kind of push her contribution factor down. And I think that a more realistic one would be to just accept that we might be at a saturation point for broadband. So I think I'll leave it at that. I've got one more slide, but I think that we can go on, and I look forward to Carol's answers and hearing from Rosalind.
So thank you, Hal. Rosalind, if you can there, Rosalind, if you can, and Carol, I'll let you have a rebuttal once Rosalind's done, just on any reactions you may have. So you can think about that a little bit in advance. Okay. Perfect.
So, well, good afternoon, everyone. It is such an honor to be here to share this platform with my distinguished colleagues. It's great to be back at TPRC. My friend David Reed, who's doing a wonderful job as a program chair, and all of this audience. There's really nowhere else in the world that has such a place like TPRC where we can talk about these issues and dig into the weeds. So thank you for this opportunity for this lunchtime learning with you. So I really love how we have had this discussion on different approaches. Carol has talked about the idea of taxing broadband. Hal has talked about taxing advertising. And I'm going to take a different approach where I'm stepping back and saying, our larger ICT economy is trillions of dollars. There's lots of cash flow. Why are we having this shortfall in broadband infrastructure? What is wrong with the business models? What's wrong with the economics that we're having these shortfalls? And I think this is a question that the TPRC research audience would think about, and they would look at a lot of different reasons and solutions. And so that's what I'm trying to be engaged with, and to share with you that I believe that we have the money in the marketplace, but our policy is out of date and it has not kept pace with the way the internet has evolved. So I'm going to crunch down my 20 minutes into 10, and I want to talk to you about what I believe is this. When we look at USF and we look at the challenges of where we're having shortfall in infrastructure, where we're going to look at the middle mile and video traffic. I want to talk to you about how two-sided markets reduce the financial burden on consumers, and also why tech companies, whether we're talking about Google or Netflix, what have you, or the streaming companies especially, why they have a responsibility to help contribute to reducing the digital divide. So we've covered, there's and also to say, I would recommend that you look at the FCC's record. We're just giving you 3 perspectives on this discussion. There are over 100 filings. There's many different points of view. It's valuable. Someone brought up this Fifth Circuit. There are those who don't believe USF is constitutional. There's a set of issues related to that. So it is absolutely appropriate that Congress is looking at this topic. And I really applaud the FCC for taking on this in this proceeding. So those of us in TPRC, we're going to bring multidisciplinary perspectives to this discussion: technology, law, economics, engineering, all of those things. So what are the couple things we can observe? Well, first of all, in the US, despite how imperfect it is, it's still amazing as other countries go. The United States is still accounting for 1/4 of the world's total private investment in broadband. So as difficult as it is, broadband companies still invest a high amount relative to their revenue so that we can have infrastructure. We have major challenges with our country being very sparsely populated. It has very few people in many places. We have also major evolution in our technology. We are constantly upgrading. That is high costs, which you can't necessarily recover from subscriptions. And we have really in the last decade, 15 years, the emergence of video. And when the internet was invented, nobody knew that video was going to be the killer app. But today, video is about 80% of the global traffic on the internet. And that has important technological implications and economic implications. So I've done you can go on to SSRN in this study on rural broadband, where I've looked at 4 rural broadband networks and their particular challenges and why they can't invest at the level they want. And what we've learned is that 5 companies, Netflix, YouTube, Disney Plus, Xbox, and Amazon Prime, account for 75% of all the traffic in these networks and 90% of the cost. And the interesting part is that the cost is primarily in the middle mile. This is not the last mile, which USF covers, it's the middle mile. This is where the handoff between the content providers and the ISPs happen. But because of the exploding rate of traffic growth, about 30% per year, there is a need to invest in servers, and you have to expend high amounts of electricity. There's labor, maintenance, construction, security. There's a whole set of costs that are going out of control in the middle mile. And that's not really understood very well by policymakers. So, and on top of that, if we look at the business model, let's say a basic broadband package is $50, about 2/3 of all broadband providers are going to have some kind of streaming, where the average is maybe about a couple of maybe $25 of streaming packages on top of the cost of broadband. So every month, this 2/3 of American broadband consumers are putting forth $75. But the part that for every dollar of streaming revenue that's earned by the content providers, the ISPs have to spend almost 50 cents to provision the middle mile. That's that investment in servers and equipment and electricity and so on. So for rural broadband providers who have very limited number of customers, limited ability to raise prices, right now prices are falling in the broadband market. So they either have to eat the cost or forego investment, because if you raise the price on a lot of these customers, they will leave. So that's a big challenge. So we have this issue, which is actually exacerbating the larger problem for everybody. So what I want to suggest to you is that we have economic models to deal with this. This is called two-sided markets, where we have on one end of a broadband market, we have end users, you and me, we're using broadband every day. And on the other, we have content providers. Now, these markets are been around for almost millennia. If we look at the newspapers, industry had advertising, and that's because we didn't want to say to the end users, you have to pay for the full cost of the newspaper. The advertisements help lower the cost for the end user, and there's different ways to advertise. And of course, that's how we enjoy a lot of the internet today. When we go onto Google, it's subsidized by advertising, as Hal described. Similarly, look at credit cards. You may have a credit card, there's an annual fee, but that doesn't cover the whole cost of the credit card network. The merchants pay a percentage to help cover the costs, so the end user, you as the credit card user, don't have to pay the cost of the whole network. So what is missing now is that our middle mile is not being operating with the proper two-sided market, because the content providers expect that they should be able to get all the traffic into the network for free. And this is a classic free rider problem that William Baumol talked about in 1952. So this is not so controversial, shouldn't be a big deal. If anybody who uses cloud services, it works on a pay-as-you-go model. The more traffic you put into the network, the more you pay, or you have volume discounts and that sort of thing. ISPs would like to be able to do something like this, but they have an inability to do so. They have no market power, especially in rural broadband areas. They can't go and say, hey, Netflix, you just put all this traffic in my network and it's causing me this extra costs. I can't raise price on my end users. Netflix is not even going to answer that email. So and there's a different set of services from what the end user gets and what the content provider gets. So the content provider in the middle mile is going to get a series of computation and database and file transfers and networking and various services. The end user is paying for broadband, is paying for the last mile construction cost, the account management, the network technology, and other things associated with the last mile. So so we have a challenge here that our business models are not there to fully recover the cost of broadband. So now I think it's important to say, tech companies invest enormously in networks. They have undersea cables, they have data centers, they have huge infrastructure for their own content themselves and their own networks. But note that these are typically in the areas that are unregulated by the FCC or other policymakers, and they're also able to exploit these through business models where ISPs can't. So, one of the other solutions proffered here is that we can just put these caches into the network. So for example, Netflix offers what's called its OCA, its Open Connect appliance. And that is in some ways actually can make the problem worse. First of all, it's not like a little thing, it's a giant set of servers. Imagine if every content provider would say, hey, put my cache into your network, pretty soon you're going to run out of space in your various offices. And the other part is, even if you have, let me just go back a moment, even if you have this kind of a content strategy, it's still a long way from the end user, and there's still a cost for the ISP to get it from its middle mile to the end user. But the other issue we have today is that video content, as amazing and wonderful as it is, it's becoming a climate burden. The higher resolution, it's the greater dynamic range, higher bit rate, all this requires greater amount of energy to power. And then this Netflix is only valuable for Netflix content. You can't reuse it for another content provider. And so it's sitting idle until the evening. And if you're the ISP who wants to make a content neutral solution and use one set of equipment for all the content in your network, you won't be able to do that. And should you want to look at one system that's the most climate friendly, if you have to adjust to every content provider's cache, you will not be able to have that that climate, that sort of economies of scale that you're going to need. Anyway, I know I'm over time. I just want to show here on the pricing. If you look at a typical network, you'll have some subset of consumers who are going to look at streaming video, and then others who won't. And the problem with raising prices on everyone is it's not fair to the end users. And this is really the issue which is driving South Korea today with the lawsuit with Netflix. There's 23 million broadband consumers, but only 5 million of them use Netflix. Should you raise the price on everyone so that Netflix can get this free delivery? Or should there be a fee imposed on Netflix? And the Korean government, various aspects, said, we think that the fee should be imposed on Netflix, which is based upon the traffic brought into the network, and that will be used to recover the costs needed to facilitate the traffic delivery. And so in terms of the solutions here, what I want to suggest is that we could look at encouraging a good faith negotiation between broadband providers and content providers to find the solutions that they need. We should consider user fees. And of course, within this broadband subsidies, there's $1 billion for middle mile construction, but that again is for new builds. It's not sufficient to address all of the, the challenges across 5,000 ISPs in the United States. And the main issue is the ongoing expense, the operating expense, not necessarily startup expense, even though that's significant. We can talk about the South Korean Netflix law if people are interested, but I just want to close here by saying, when we go back to our larger ecosystem for ICT, broadband industry is $300 billion. The 6 top largest tech companies in the US are 1.5 trillion. So they're 5 times greater with much greater profitability. We've been squeezing out from the broadband side all the money we can, whereas where the wealth is, where the profitability is and the money is, they're not having to contribute, these social obligations. So, and on top of that, there's certain kind of traffic which is creating cost. It's not the social benefit services, the Zoom calls like we're doing today, or the, payments or e-commerce. It's actually video entertainment. It's a privately valuable service that is discretionary based upon the person. So our policy should evolve for this, and I'm really glad that Congress is looking at it. And I thank all of you for the time today to share this with you.
Thank you. Okay, so we got a lot to unpack here. But first, Carol, do you have any reactions to what Hal was saying in terms of some of the concerns raised in your study? Oh, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. I muted myself so you wouldn't hear me coughing. I want to engage a bit on our differing assessments of what the contribution factor would be if broadband was included. And I think the audience needs to understand there were two primary differences between how I computed the number and how Hal computed the number. When I computed the number, I was including both mobile broadband as well as wireline broadband revenues in the broadband revenues bucket, and Hal only included wireline revenues. So that's significant difference number one. And then secondly, I was relying upon the FCC's own estimates of program demand as taken from the 10-year forecast that it submits to the Office of Management and Budget, which goes to Congress, as to their estimate of what they think program demand will be over the horizon that I was doing the calculations. I did it basically 4 years out. And Hal instead is assuming that the Universal Service Fund will grow to be $17 billion by the year 2029. And, you know, we can all debate whether or not the FCC would do that, but I was trying to apply a consistent set of numbers, the FCC's own numbers, as to what it projects today will be the actual demand. And so when you have a different numerator and a different denominator, necessarily you're going to get different numbers. But I think it's important to realize that the analyses were done in two different ways.
Okay. And so well, Hal, anything quick?
Yeah, can I? Yeah,
Yeah,
I was
sure.
on mute.
Yeah, okay.
We're cursed with the damn mute buttons. So I think that you know, we intentionally left mobile out of the equation, and I think the reason why, you know, we wrote the paper, you know, at kind of the onset of the pandemic, and I think that the notion that going and telling some poor family what this is about, right, is subsidizing broadband for low-income households. And to tell them that we're gonna put you into a mobile solution as opposed to a landline solution has been insulting. So we just took that out of the equation. And if mobile isn't going to be what's going to be subsidized at the end of the day, then there's no reason why mobile should even be involved in the calculus. So that's we just think that if you're going to solve this problem of disconnected low-income families from the internet, you know, trying to do homework from your home, we don't want to tell some poor kid that he's got to do his homework, you know, on a mobile connection. So, or that some unemployed person is going to have to look for a job, you know, on a mobile connection. Now, with respect to moving it beyond the current base, I realize what the FCC did 10 years ago projection, but Congress, in trying to address the current problem that we have today, which is how do you connect, you know, 30 million people, low-income Americans that lack a fixed broadband connection. Congress thought the number was between $30 and $50 a month. The $9 a month is not going to cut it, as evidenced by the fact that almost no one takes the $9 because it barely makes a dent on the bill. So we have to get serious about what it's going to take to solve the problem. And $9 is not going to solve it. And so that's why you've got to grow the program if you're serious about the problem.
I don't disagree that $9.25 is not a realistic subsidy to ensure that low-income households can actually subscribe to meaningful broadband that they can use for schooling and everything else that they need it for. I think the fact that Congress has created the Affordable Connectivity Program has, for, you know, lack of a better word, it has postponed the need for the FCC to at least immediately decide what it's going to do about Lifeline. And you're right, you know, years down the road, you know, if we get to, you know, not if, when we get to the end of the money that Congress has appropriated for the Affordable Connectivity Program, then there's going to be a debate about whether Congress needs to appropriate more monies or whether the FCC needs to fold that into the existing universal service funding framework. But that's really premature to, know what the answer is going to be, and the point of my recommendation was the funding is clearly declining, and there's a clear consensus, all of the parties that have filed in the FCC's docket, there's a clear consensus that the current system is broken and something needs to be done. And my point was, this is something that can be done immediately. And obviously there are other ideas that others have proposed and we'll continue to discuss, but like the FCC can't afford to sit around for 3 more years trying to fix this problem. Like it really needs to buckle down and at least take the immediate steps that it can.
So this touches on just a general question, because what you're talking about a little bit is in looking at the contribution side here, there might be further reforms that are needed in the 4 programs in USF themselves, right? And like the level of subsidy and things like that. Are there any other elements here? I know, Carol, like your report is focused on, again, on fixing the contribution problem, and that is a problem. But are we done with the reform, so to speak, in the 4 programs in order to help,
We'll have to wait for what the FCC says in its report to Congress, because Congress expressly told the FCC to, examine what the future of the Universal Service Fund is. And they saw comment on all 4 distribution programs, as well as the contribution methodology. So they've got an ample record on all aspects, both the distribution side and the contribution side. There's one other thing I want to mention. I know, Hallie, you said you didn't think it made sense to include broadband revenues in the contribution base. And then you talked about how, it's not appropriate to assume low-income families would only have a mobile subscription. And I think it's, from my perspective, like the services that contribute to Universal Service Fund, the Universal Service Fund, that doesn't mean those are the specific services that you have to have consumers be subscribing to in the Lifeline program. I view those 2 as independent decisions. And obviously the way the Lifeline program is set up and the way the Affordable Connectivity program have been set up, it's up to the customer to decide whether they want to use the subsidy for either a mobile subscription or a fixed subscription. And today, the figures on the Affordable Connectivity program, which is the $30 a month subsidy, previously was the $50 a month for the emergency broadband. Even today, roughly 80% of the consumers that are taking that higher subsidy are still choosing to apply it to a mobile subscription. So that's by consumer choice. That's not the government telling them what to do.
David, may I go back to what you were saying about, are we done with this? To be honest, I think we're just getting started. There is a court case. There's a group, Consumers Research. There is a group of consumers who feel that the USF is unconstitutional, that it is a unconstitutional taxing of consumers by an agency that does not have enough or the appropriate congressional authority. So I'm not saying that I agree with it. I just want to say that's out there. There are other perspectives here. There's similarly a lot of groups across the spectrum who think that the contribution base needs to be expanded, meaning other kinds of companies, not the 10, good old ISPs that we're always relying on, that we need to expand it. So this notion that Congress needs to take time to look at it is absolutely appropriate. I don't think this is going to be a quick decision, and it shouldn't be, because I think Hal's point is correct, that if we want to do the right public policy, we need to go to Congress and study it. And that will take time. And in order to get it right, it isn't a quick fix at this time. In fact, if you go back to 1996, there were policymakers at the time who thought the business models would emerge to supplant USF. They would have no idea that it's grown to what it has today. It's become $9–10 billion. They would be shocked that, it hasn't, other things have not evolved. So, but
Okay.
I would also say there's a lot we don't understand.
Right. So, and just, I think is in your comments that I looked, Rosalind, and question for Carol or how you mentioned that the statute says that requires, as section 254, I think, requires its telecommunications service. Would that, with your proposal, Carol, be requiring it to be reclassified or not?
No, my proposal does not require that broadband internet access be reclassified. The statute basically has 2 parts to it. There is a mandatory obligation to assess telecommunications services. There is the FCC, but the statute also gives the FCC the authority, if the public interest warrants, to assess telecommunications. And that is the part of the statute that the FCC chose to rely upon when it chose to assess VoIP. It did not classify VoIP as a telecom service. Rather, it relied on what is known as its discretionary authority. And that court case, that was actually challenged in court, and the FCC won. So this is not a stalking horse for the whole Title I, Title II debate. You know, it is my firm belief that the FCC has the statutory authority to assess broadband internet access, because we all can agree that it does contain telecommunications.
Okay.
David, David, is it okay? Carol raised a point, and then Rosalind took the mic, which was great. But would I have a chance
to respond to me?
You know, Carol raised a good point about should we, you know, if we could design this from scratch, and if the purpose of this bill would be to address the 30 million Lifeline eligible households right now who are lacking a wireline broadband connection. I think there's a good policy question here, and I don't have the answers. Do we want to allow that family with this $30 to $50 a month subsidy to use the money instead of taking a wireline connection, which I think would be the purpose and intent of the bill, to go out and get a wireless connection instead? I think there's an argument. I don't want to necessarily hunker down here, but there's an argument to say, no, this program that I have in mind would be about getting a wireline connection to a low-income family that doesn't have one. And then number two, even if you gave them the flexibility to spend it on a wireless connection instead, I still, from a policy perspective, don't think that makes good sense to expose the mobile operators to a new broadband tax, because it'll have the same effect on pass-through and disconnects as you would see on the wireline space. That is, you have to. I want to try to get Carol sensitized to this problem, that if you start putting new fees, loading up new fees on the wireless bill or the wireline bill for broadband, that you are going to chase some subscribers off the network by virtue of the pass-through, right? You're always going to do it. And so for that reason, I don't think that mobile should be even part of this calculus.
Okay. Let me jump in here. We've got some questions from the audience here. First couple here, one anonymous, one from Eric Ralph, basically saying, you know, one is, does the infrastructure legislation, the Infrastructure Act, can we get anything there to help? And Eric's perspective, you know, would it be more efficient if we could just fund it out of the federal budget, rather than taking, you know, a special tax on one of these services like broadband supply?
Well, the problem with funding USF out of annual appropriations is then the funding programs are held hostage to the annual budgetary cycle, where we go approximately, you know, halfway through the fiscal year with a continuing resolution, and then at some point in the year, Congress basically, you know, passes an appropriations bill. And you know, these programs, you know, as they are currently constituted, are set up in a way that are providing monthly recurring payments, whether it's monthly recurring payments to Lifeline customers, whether it's reimbursements to schools and libraries that have obtained services through the E-rate program, or whether it's monthly payments to firms that are participating in the high cost program. You can't have a situation where you literally go half the year without knowing whether you've got the budgetary authority to make the payments. That's the primary problem with appropriations.
I agree.
Then, and on this question for you, Hal, on can you clarify if your proposal is designed to pay for the ACP program or USF?
No, I'm doing this under the USF design. I'm focused, as I say in the report, on subsidizing low-income Americans in their purchase of a wireline broadband connection, right? So to answer the prior question, we think that there are a bunch of programs, at least are underway. I don't know if they've been funded yet, to address what we call the supply side of the equation, which is getting a subsidy to the providers to go out and to build in areas that are currently considered to be unviable or uneconomic. What our paper is focused on is how do you create a sustainable source of funding to provide a demand side subsidy to low-income Americans so that they can have a fixed wireline high-speed connection.
Okay, another question here. If Congress can spend 60 billion on rural broadband in less than a year, what makes the panelists think that Congress can't pass a bill in a year that empowers the FCC to hold a rulemaking and require all beneficiaries of the network to help pay for it?
I agree with that. I don't think that this necessarily means delay to both Carol and to Rosalind. I think that this could be decided fairly quickly as to whether or not we want to empower the FCC to impose this fee on the cause of the costs, which are these two digital advertising service providers primarily. So yeah, let's do it and let's move. I don't see why this thing needs to take more than a month or so.
Okay. Anybody else on that? Rosalind, do you want on Kevin Taglin's question about rural broadband deployment?
Yes, so the other point here I think is worth making. We have just had $60 billion. It's really historic amount of broadband subsidies. And I also think, a number of commenters raised that it's valuable to reassess USF in light of these huge subsidies and how exactly will those things interplay. And for that reason, not to move quickly, we need to know where will that 60 billion go and what will new monies be used for. Now, even with the 60 billion, there will, which I understand a lot of it will be for new builds, create for getting service to underserved people or unserved people. But once you build the network, there's still ongoing costs, and they're not zero and they're not insignificant, because you will have to maintain the network. You will have growing traffic costs for video and so on. And even with the 60 billion now, there's shortage, I think, of workers, equipment because of supply chain challenges. So I think everyone's appreciative that that is there. But this is, I think, the point that I want to make. What is the larger business model for broadband? And what we're working with is predicated on decades old sense that we buy this one subscription for a flat fee or flat service, and there's nothing else that we adapt or change, and there's no support from third parties. And that is really out of date with our needs today, which is very dynamic internet use and the digital economy that we want to have. So it is time that we update all of this. And we need to look at how are all the ways that money can be recovered to support the ongoing cost of infrastructure. Remember, a network is like a gallon of milk. It will expire. You have to constantly upgrade it. And companies also are investing in 5G, 6G, 7G, the DOCSIS standards. So all of the providers, they have to upgrade their networks or they will lose subscribers.
Right. And under your analysis with the high cost of the middle mile, that emphasize that's for the rural area, right? And so that's
it is, but it does. I mean, my study was only looking at rural. I looked at 4 broadband, and it was quite acute in the rural areas because there's limited number of customers to recover costs. Exactly. But I understand that I've also learned that this is a problem in mobile networks. It's a problem in urban areas, and it's a problem in South Korea, which really is quite an eye opener. It's the world's considered the #1 broadband market for access, use, and skills, high levels of investment. But what happens if you have one content provider whose traffic increases by a factor of 24 in a short period of time? How are you going to recover the cost for that? To the broadband provider's credit, they never slowed or stopped the content. They kept delivering the Netflix content the whole time, even though they were incurring tremendous costs to have to get it there. And, they had no means to recover. And that's what this lawsuit is ongoing about presently.
That's the virtuous cycle, right? So, so we're at the end of time here. This has been a fabulous discussion. What I'd like to do for each one of the panelists is just to give you, 1 minute, 2 minutes max on just what thoughts do you want to leave the audience with here? With regard to this topic or issue or things to watch, whatever you want to choose. So I will start in I'll start with you, Rosalind. I'll go in the
Yeah.
opposite order.
Well, very simply, I think big tech and the big streamers, they've had a free ride on America's broadband networks for too long, and it's time they pay their fair share.
Okay, Hal?
Well, I don't know if I can top that, but I would commend folks to go look at my paper, look at Carol's paper, and see if you can get comfortable with the idea of the digital advertising revenues serving as the source of this ongoing, sustainable, growing base that will allow us to make a huge dent on families, low-income families that lack a fixed wireline, high-speed broadband connection.
Okay. Carol?
Well, I think what I would say is this is a topic that the FCC has been thinking about for 20 years, and it's time for the FCC to do something. And that does not necessarily preclude Congress from doing something in the future, but I think the FCC needs to do something.
Yeah. And stay tuned for when August is when they're supposed to get the report out. So we will stay tuned and be able to debate it at TPRC 2022. Okay, so so final plug for that. Please put it on your calendar and plan to participate. We hope to all be there in person. We do have a virtual element to it if fate intervenes, but otherwise, with that, I'd want to thank Petrus, you for helping to be the instigator for this, and for all of our panelists for this debate of just an incredibly important topic over the long run. That's been a little bit of a sleeper, but has incredible importance, I think, policy-wise for the emergence of broadband and where the nation goes as it invests in this in critical infrastructure for us. So with that, thank you very much, and we will adjourn.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you
Bye-bye,
for
guys.
having me.
Everybody.
Bye-bye.
It's a pleasure to talk with you all.